Okay, good morning. Welcome to this Policy Insights webinar. My name is James Walsh. I'm Head of Member Engagement here at the PLSA, and we're going to be talking today about giving you an update on lifetime provider, small pots, and DC issues. I'm joined by two of my colleagues who are going to talk us through these issues, and I'm going to ask them to come in and introduce themselves. So, Joe, are you right there, Joe?
Hi, thanks, James, and hello, everybody. I'm Joe Dabrowski. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy here at the PLSA. Essentially look after most policy areas and also the Pay Your Pension Some Attention campaign, the Pension Quality Mark, and the Cost Transparency Initiative.
Thanks, Joe. Lots to keep you busy there. And we've got Alyshia Harrington-Clark as well.
Hi, James. Morning, everyone. I'm Alyshia. My job title is Head of DC, Master Trust and Lifetime Savings. I guess the easiest way to describe this is if it's a DC related issue, me or someone in my team looks after it.
Okay, thank you, Alyshia. I think probably the longest job title at the PLSA, so therefore most work to do, I'm sure. So let's just run through the plan for what we're going to do in the next 44 minutes or so. We're going to start with just a few minutes on pensions dashboards, because although we're going to spend most of our time looking at small pots and lifetime provider, the dashboards issue is quite important context. And I know Joe and Alyshia just want to explain how that kind of fits together with those other elements. So Joe will talk us through dashboards. We'll have a comment on it also from Alyshia, and then time for a couple of questions on dashboards. So do get typing your questions into the Q&A box, please. Then we'll move on to small pots. And again, Joe will give us an update, an assessment of the state of play, will be some comment from Alyshia, time for a couple of questions again. And then we'll do the same on lifetime provider with Joe and Alyshia and questions. And hopefully we'll have a few more minutes right at the end for plenty more questions. I'm always keen to get you involved. So do put them in the Q&A box or comments in the chat box. And you can use that upvote facility in the Q&A box. Terrible verb, but it's a good descriptor to vote for the question you most like, and those are the ones we're going to focus on. We will circulate the slides from this and also the recording in a day or two, so look out for those. So let's get straight into it with pensions dashboards. And Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. I should probably also add that if there are questions on other topics that you want to ask us about, please feel free to chip those questions in at the end. We're happy to kind of range and answer as much as we can today or to take them away. So I think just a very quick update on pensions dashboard. And a lot of the themes that we're talking about today are interconnected and certainly will be over time. Pensions dashboards, big issue for the industry. We've been working on things for the last couple of years, all trying to get ready, all waiting for a variety of legislation and standards to come through. I think we're in a good place now. By and large, most things are done. We're not expecting any more legislation, but we are expecting some standards. And those standards will be really important for how people prepare and get ready, certainly for those onboarding deadlines that filter through in 2026. So not too long at all to get ready. I think there's been a little bit of a hiatus in updates from the dashboard group, but probably useful to know that we're expecting in the very near future an update on what those standards will ultimately look like. So people can begin to get ready, think about that preparation, and also kind of set up teams to potentially start thinking about how that gets operated, put into operation properly. Now, Alyshia might have some other points to make in terms of what we've been hearing from members more generally about readiness and the importance of dashboards.
Thanks, Joe. Alyshia?
Thank you very much. So I think
one of the things that I'd just add is that, as Joe mentioned, we need to be able to get ready. And we do have issues with readiness on an ongoing basis, I guess, some of the time. So yeah, I guess one of the things that we are really keen to have is that guidance and some of those sort of standards points. And as you'll see from the slide, actually, one of the best sources for this is the PDP website. I'd encourage you to all look at that. And let us know if you have any issues or experience any questions, you know, sort of experience anything that you think there are some questions on throughout, so that we can feed that back. But like Joe says, we are really, I guess, in a sort of wait and see type space at the moment. I think also the other thing I would say is that we are hoping that we'll get some updates pretty soon. So so watch this space.
Mark Dowsey, in the chat there, but do remember to put questions in the Q&A box. But I think, to be fair to Mark, it's probably more of a comment. He says he's heard there might be some tweaks to regulations. For example, relaxing the requirement that AVC and main scheme illustration dates are aligned. Joe, Alyshia, is that something you've been hearing?
I don't think there's a clear steer that will come through yet. I think there's been a lot of debate behind the scenes on how to kind of make things work, given some of the changes and the kind of deadline shifting slightly to the right as we've gone through waiting for the standards. But I'm happy to pick that up and come back if we hear a little bit more.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Joe. And we've got a question from David Warwick. Do you know when the FCA will be publishing the finalised pension dashboards regulations? Do we have any idea of the timing on that? Alyshia, you're shaking your head. That's a straight no. Joe, any insight?
I think there is a sort of a bit of a logjam of various things within both the regulators and ministries at the moment, partly with some of the focus of ministers being elsewhere. So no certainty, I'm afraid.
Okay, that's a shocking concept, Joe, that ministers' focus might be elsewhere. I don't know what you could possibly mean by that. Okay, so thanks for that quick update on dashboards. Let's move on to small pots, because there's, I think, more going on there at the moment. Joe, where are we up to on the whole small pots issue?
Thanks, James. We are moving forward with small pots, but I think probably it's worth going back to some basics, really. Kind of what is the small pots problem, how big is it, and why does it still persist? I think what we know is that the small pots question was a sort of a known issue at the creation of AE, recognizing that people would churn jobs and there would be a creation of small pots as part of that process. There clearly has been hope that we would find a solution a little bit sooner than we have. But, you know, there are some of those elements as well about that kind of setup of AE that kind of led to where we've got to. Certainly a kind of an open season on who could be a provider at the beginning led to a proliferation of provision, which has shrunk somewhat with the creation of the Master Trust authorization regime, and where we probably will expect to see some continuation of consolidation in that bit of the market over the next 5 to 10 years. So what are we facing, really? We are facing potentially up to 30 million small pots by the end of the decade. So that is a lot of small pots for the industry to deal with, for savers to keep track of, and also creates quite a lot of that friction within the system, and probably combinations of engagement and practical issues. So known issue, we've been talking about it, thinking about it in the industry for a while, and what can we do about it? The topic that we've just talked about, dashboard, will ultimately make it somewhat easier for people to keep track of their pensions and make sure that they don't kind of lose track of them and understand what they've got. But the kind of fundamental issue of the creation of small pots and the stickiness that it makes within the system, and possibly the challenges around value for money, will still exist. So we've been looking at how to address that issue for a number of years now, so including the DWP group that looked at this a couple of years ago. Following that, a PLSA and ABI joint project across the industry, looking at how to bring forward solutions for small pots and what might that look like over a period of time, looking at the kind of push and pull factors, the creation of solutions and recommendations. So there's been an awful lot of thinking, and that ultimately led to DDP consulting on its approach, its preferred approach, last year. And that was to move towards a default consolidator model, which includes setting up a number of providers who would be those default consolidators, likely enveloped into the master trust authorization regime. And then people would be essentially selecting a default consolidator and being carouseled around potentially. So where have we gotten to with that process? At the beginning of this year, the new pensions minister, Paul Maynard, set up the default consolidator delivery group. And that is looking at building towards examining what this new default consolidator regime might look like. It's got a kind of top group, which we're involved with, and a series of expert groups, both kind of provider and delivery experts underneath that supporting the project. It's got a fairly aggressive timetable given the political landscape, which is to try and come up with a recommendation for the new way of the default consolidator system working by the end of this year, with an intention to try and perhaps partway through the year give an update to ministers on the direction of travel. Now, what's it going to look at? It's going to look at a series of core functions, which will then be considered in more depth by DWP. So the role and function of a clearinghouse for small pots, how we can get to a position where we've got the design of a low cost and efficient transfer system. Clearly, there is some work to do there. Authorization and monitoring approach for default consolidator schemes. That would likely include what are the criteria for those schemes, what are some of the operational and practical behaviours that those schemes would need to demonstrate in order to be suitable. How the choice and impact of having a default consolidator model will impact on communication to members and savers about where they'll be, what their choices are, and how things might impact them should they be default consolidated. And also, very importantly, kind of what does that member journey look like? How does that kind of flow through from participation with one employer and potentially moving to another with a small pot work? Interactions with things like the pensions dashboard program. So how does that small pot and that default consolidator element get captured on the dashboard ultimately? And what happens when the pot moves, and how does that get displayed and shown ultimately as well? And I think then more broadly, we'll be into questions about how do you go about implementing this, over what timescale, through which legislative provisions, and how does that impact the market more generally? So some big questions still to be answered. We are very much at the sort of early stages of the work. The group has met once. It will be meeting again in a couple of weeks' time. So there's a lot of work to be done. We'll be working with our members in order to feed into that group to understand their views and perspectives and the things that are kind of priority issues. Also, there'll be quite a lot of close working between the delivery group and also the kind of subgroups to understand how those practical issues work through into policy reality. So we want to make sure there isn't a disparity between essentially what we might call the sort of policy wonks and the delivery experts. So actually what we dream up at the delivery group and think about doesn't get lost in translation and become something that's impossible essentially to plumb into the system. So there's a lot of work to go on, but actually early days and a real chance to kind of influence how the shape of the default consolidator model will work in future. Clearly a big impact on savers ultimately, looking at that kind of position where we're at now, probably 15 or so million lost pots to be moved around. So we're looking at how this is going to kind of impact that stock and potentially that flow of future small pots as well. So exciting times, but plenty of work to be done.
We'll move on to Alyshia. I think you're going to have a comment as well on small pots, and we'll come back to the questions. Alyshia.
Thank you, James. So I think the main thing that I wanted to comment on is the impact of the small pot solution once we have the introduction of the AE reform. So we are overdue the AE review, the 2017 review reforms. And I know that there is a sort of, I guess, debate really to be had about the degree to which we can do those sorts of reforms without having a small pot solution. So I think I just wanted to emphasize that we see these things as very highly connected. You'd sort of build at the beginning, James, that a lot of this stuff is connected, and dashboards is connected to small pots because DWP has connected the two and said that we need some of the work from the first for the second, but also just more generally, small pot solutions are needed in order to accommodate wider changes to AE. So just to follow that logic through in case it's not clear, the debate is really whether you can start to extend the application of AE without addressing, to younger people, for example, without addressing the likely impact of that for them, which is that they accrue many more small pots. And so you do sort of need one and the other at the same time. I guess this is an illustration of how interconnected all of these pieces are, but also how critical it is that every piece works in concert and every piece works together. The only other thing I would say, Joe did mention this, but the delivery mechanism and I guess the structures and I guess like the infrastructure is not really the best word, but the infrastructure around small pots is really critical. Joe did describe how there are sort of several steps there, but I think one of the things that we're hearing really clearly from members in this iteration of the work, but we've heard it many times before as well in previous iterations or previous considerations of these solutions, that you have to get the nuts and bolts right. And if you don't get the nuts and bolts right, you can essentially undo all of the good work that you could be trying to achieve, I guess, throughout by doing the policy solution. So again, to extend the logic there, or to explain the logic there, one of the benefits, and I can see one of the questions in the chat is about the benefits to the member. One of the benefits to the member is essentially the idea or the theory that their costs would reduce over time, because everyone's costs reduce as you achieve greater efficiency within the system. Now, that is only the case, and it's really only the case, if you could get things like the cost of transfers to be very low. Without that, a model like default consolidators, or indeed really any other small pot solution that's ever been considered, and this is why this has come up several times before, is undermined quite substantially, because if the cost of transfer is very high, then you might have a lovely idea about how you're going to combine all of those pots, but you could erode them just by transferring them. And so this is what I mean about the sort of the infrastructure or the universe, the ecosystem around the solution needs to be really tight as well. So I think all I'm really doing is emphasising two things that Joe already really said, but I do think they're pretty critical, and I do think they really underpin the next steps. And this is why we're really pleased about that delivery group and the subgroups. They are going to focus on some of those, I guess, key critical contingencies that are needed to make this solution work.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Alyshia, and particularly the interconnectedness of all this. We've got one or two questions. Let's have a look at those. I think you've half answered one of them, Alyshia, but Matthew Webb asks, is there a consensus on the definition of a small pot? How much? What's the answer?
We have discussed this probably at great length in a variety of the groups. When we did the work with the industry and the ABI, we essentially settled on a view that we probably thought that was closer to £500 than anything else. In DWP's subsequent consultations and responses, I think their view is a little closer to 1,000. I think it's probably a debate that we'll continue to have, but it is in that spot between 500 and 1,000 that people are largely thinking. There is a question of how does that number drift over time? People begin to save more on the whole, but I think we're sort of looking at that level.
Okay, thanks, Joe. I will come on to John Levy's question in a moment, but I see Philip Begley has put a sort of question in the chat. Hi all, he hopes we're well. We are. Thank you, Philip. Is the logical inference of what Alyshia is saying that we won't get a consultation on expanding auto-enrollment until the recommendations have come out of the smallpox delivery group, i.e. probably not this year? What can we say about the timing of all this, Alyshia?
I wouldn't necessarily say that. So I wasn't suggesting that one couldn't happen without the other. I was more meaning that one could undermine the other. I think in terms of the timing of the 2017 review, we're effectively waiting for, well, government space. I think that's the case with a lot of these things, really. And we don't foresee that much space. We are continuing to push on that because we think it's absolutely critical that we get those 2017 review reforms through. And I mean, I guess without being super glib, the clue is in the name, right? They were 2017 review findings, and we're now in 2024. So we are still in a space that those need to happen. I wouldn't want to assume that you wouldn't get one without the other because they're sort of disconnected processes. In a sense, one is procedural and the other, the smallpox stuff still needs to be worked out. We still need to do the work there. So sorry, I didn't mean to infer that you wouldn't get one without the other. I just meant to imply that they are sort of intrinsically connected, almost on a theory basis.
Okay, fine. And I'm going to pick up a question from John Levy. Alyshia, I think you did you touched on this, but there may be more to say. So he asks, this may be a silly question, but if someone has a small pot with ABC Pension Company, this, as I understand it, will mean it automatically gets transferred to XYZ insurer. The reality is that the person still has a small pot, just with a different company. Other than perhaps a charging improvement, which is by no means a given, what's the benefit here? Is there anything more you want to say on that?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of benefits potentially for the saver. I think one of those is the cost point that I made earlier about theoretically there's a lower cost. I think also theoretically savers will have a better idea of their total pot, so the total saving once all of those pots are combined. I would also, though, add, sorry, this is going to get a bit dull, but I would also add that there is a connection, therefore, with dashboards. So you can have a view of all of your pots without necessarily them being all combined. So there is a sort of connection there. I think the other thing I would pick up on in that specific question is that there is no implication at the moment that they would all move to an insurer. So at the moment, the way that the default consolidator model is envisaged is that an entity would be authorised as a default consolidator. So that wouldn't necessarily be an insurer. It could well be a master trust, or it could theoretically be some other kind of entity that's just created for the purpose of default consolidating. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind, actually, is that there's no... Some of the detail here is yet to be established. And so I think the benefits to savers could be important to consider in the context of that detail. I think the only other thing that I would point out about small pots is some of the original motive for consolidating small pots was actually minimising loss rather than increasing benefit. So I feel like that it maybe sounds like semantics, but it is pretty critical as well. So if you think about the losses that you might perceive of having individual pots all over the place, that might be things like suboptimal decision making against those individual pots that you've left in a certain place and completely forgotten about. It might not be that there would be some magical money tree that you're going to achieve by putting that into another, consolidating that into another pot, but at least you'd give it some scrutiny, for example. So there's some sort of subtleties about also avoiding losses. And one of the biggest avoidance of losses there is really for the whole industry. So when you look at the projection for how many small pots there are going to be, the inefficiency of that for the system as a whole is so extreme if left unaddressed, that you can definitely foresee that savers would, feel the pain of those losses over time. So I think it's not just about the benefits, it's not just about insurers, it's also about losses too.
Thanks, that makes sense. And I think that keys in with a couple of comments I'm seeing in the chat, Alyshia, from Lizzie Holiday and Mark Dowsey again. You know, a lot of people have got multiple small parts, just sort of confusing, risk of bad decisions, as you say. Okay, let's move on to our third and perhaps biggest issue, the lifetime provider issue. Joe, would you like to bring us up to date? Where are we on that?
Thanks, James. So where are we up to with lifetime provider? A topic which has generated a lot of conversation over the last couple of months. And I think in a different selection of formats or strata has been proposed by people within the industry for a number of years. So it kind of comes from a position of trying to resolve the small pots issue, and also perhaps try and tackle some of the kind of engagement and confusion that some members tend to face when trying to understand their pensions and where they are and all the rest of it. So what has happened, we've had a very early stage call for evidence from DWP, essentially exploring what a lifetime provider model might look like, and potentially the benefits, very much seeking evidence from the industry about how it thinks about things, what it thinks the opportunities, the risks, the challenges are. DWP are kind of in the process of reviewing the responses to the call for evidence. I think I should probably say that in the small pots delivery group, the minister, when he spoke, was very clear to say that he saw the two things as very separate and different, and working across different timetables. So they are very much in the kind of taking stock phase of lifetime providers. But there is a little bit of interest that I think remains, partly because of the kind of implied simplicity of the model and the choice, the consumer choice element, which philosophically, I think, is appealing to some. I think there wasn't a great deal of detail in the design document and the call for evidence, and there's a lot of material in there that we and our members, when we talk to them, have got a lot of concerns about. So we think there's an awful lot of work to be done to understand the kind of combinations of the evidence, the impact, and whether this would be beneficial at all to savers. And I think that is one of our big challenges. Does this ultimately make savers better off? And I think the jury is very much out on that question. So what did we find issue with largely as part of the consultation? What was the feedback from our members? Quite a few things. It is a very radical departure from the model that we have got today for automatic enrolment. And that has been one of the great policy successes of the last 10 to 20 years. So if you're going to change something that radically, let's think about, does it have big benefits or does it not? It is a shift away from employer-led supported models of provision and pensions, which have been vital and essential throughout the history of largely workplace pension provision in the UK. So that's a big change. What is the impact of that? The employers that we spoke to largely indicated that it would probably lead to people thinking about pensions as the lowest in their lowest common denominator form, which would be essentially, this is a compliance exercise. I am by and large only going to be doing the minimum statutory requirement. And that's a big issue, because when we think about the challenge that really faces us in DC, probably the biggest challenge of all in UK pension saving is the question of adequacy. And the question of adequacy has to be tackled through increased employer support and contributions, as well as increased levels of savings for the majority or the average saver at a minimum. There are questions probably about where that needs to happen at the kind of lower end of the market. But for the typical person, they're not saving up, quite frankly. And if we've got distractions from that or things that get in the way, that is probably a bigger problem than trying to fiddle with the system in order to get different outcomes. And we also know that employees and savers don't have a great deal of confidence or financial literacy. It's a sad fact that in the UK, evidence from the FCA indicates only 5% of savers have got a decent degree of financial literacy. So if you're moving to a market which is very much more retail driven and choice driven, then it's putting a lot more pressure onto individuals who probably, frankly, aren't going to be in a place to be able to kind of cope and make informed decisions. And then there are separate questions that come through from the asymmetry of information that might emerge from that place, including the evidence that you see from overseas where they've moved to similar models, where you have a very big and sudden increase in marketing costs and people trying to capture customers, essentially. And what you see is 40% increases from Australia in terms of marketing spend. You see that kind of retailization of pricing and costs, and so therefore ultimately a loss of value for members. In the evidence that we gathered for our call for evidence response, you can see a £1,800 a year difference in pensions outcomes between somebody being charged at a kind of very typical AE charge rate versus a typical retail price rate at the moment, that 0.5 versus typical 1.5. So quite a lot of issues there. And then you've got a whole batch of other associated issues, which are kind of building different clearinghouses, different payroll systems. What is the total cost benefit analysis for changing the entirety of the system? And I guess also, do you get to a place where people's choices and outcomes drive different behaviors? We see evidence from elsewhere, whether it's the annuity market or potentially bank account market, that people tend to be quite sticky once they have selected something at the kind of beginning of the process. They don't shop around as truly informed economic units. They do silly human things, quite frankly, and that is an obstacle to change. So there are quite a lot of big issues to work through. And I guess the other question really is, we've talked about some of the other things that are happening. Dashboards. We haven't talked about value for money, but we will have a value for money framework coming through, and DVP hopes to have that in place for 2027. And then a default. So the world that we'll be operating in, potentially, that this discusses, is going to be very different, quite frankly. People's engagement will be altered by their ability to see things on the dashboard. The creation of default consolidators will largely mean that the creation of stock or flow pots will probably be mostly resolved, or there'll be very small windows where people have got small pots. And then value for money will flush out any schemes or funds or providers that aren't offering good services, and is likely to lead to a more concentrated market too. So the world that this might operate in, I think, is going to be very different. And so trying to answer today's thoughts or challenges around it feels quite premature. So I think what we need to do is see how these other big initiatives get delivered. What's the impact of them once they are in place? How does that change scheme behavior, provider behavior, and most importantly, saver behaviors and saver outcomes? And then let's consider, do we need something else? What is that thing? I think from our members, by and large, it's actually concentrate on these big things. Also, do not get distracted away from the question of adequacy. Let's stop putting off the adequacy question, please, and get going with the regulation and the other issues around that before we get into thinking about more complex or additional changes.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yeah, it's a very clear message. And just looking at the chat, I can see quite a bit of skepticism, I think it's fair to say, about this. Perhaps put a little less politely than you put it. But let's get Alyshia's perspective on lifetime provider. Alyshia.
Thank you.
So I guess one of the things I'd like to just show you quickly is something that we have been thinking about in terms of contingency. So this is just a visual representation really of some of the things that Joe mentioned, but I think
it links very, or it illustrates why we need to talk about a lot of different things connectedly. So you'll see that there's dashboards at the top, then we've got the small pots consolidators. Joe mentioned VFM. So value for money assessment is really pretty critical, I would argue, before you could do anything as radical, I'm going to say it, as lifetime provider implementation. Well, and even, to be honest, assessment, because without doing that, you would have no real way to facilitate a choice, to be honest, between providers. And that seemed pretty critical. I'm trying not to be too skeptical, but pretty critical in the rationale provided by the government to consider it in the first place. So I think you can't really do anything without VFM. Decumulation, here on the slide, it says to ensure that there's no need to switch schemes at the point of decumulation. It would be a bit bizarre were we to not have forthcoming decumulation changes and policy, because people would then have to potentially switch again if after accumulation into a decumulation solution. And so that really does seem odd. I think also one of the areas where there really wasn't very much detail was the idea of a CDC lifetime provider. So a sort of a variation on the theme of lifetime provider delivered via, alongside, instead of, only through CDC. All of that was a little bit unclear. But obviously you'd need a pretty thriving CDC market before you would be able to do that. So again, that one seems really, really critical. And then the final bit on the slide is more of a sort of, I'm trying to be a bit more generous again, not betraying my own skepticism. And I think hopefully, James, you're going to put some of those more skeptical questions to us in a second. But the lifetime provider model, in theory, would have to be proven that it was beneficial to members, right? So to me, I think you would have to have some kind of voluntary lifetime provider or something, some kind of test case first, in order to make sure that you knew that people were actually making good choices. And so to me, that final sort of dot and line on the slide just, I guess, moots the question that were you to try and do this, you'd really need to do it in a robust way. And I guess one of the ways you could do that is by having a test case. But again, trying not to be super critical to begin with, James.
Very measured of you, Alyshia. I know we've got about 6 minutes left, so let's just see if we can take all the questions. But you're right, there is quite a bit of skepticism in the chat. I can see Tim Banks there saying he struggles to see how this is a priority after dashboards, small pots, adequacy, decumulation, etc. It's John Levis saying the focus should be on improving auto-enrollment rates rather than this change, but that part is alarmingly conspicuous by its absence. And of course, that is an issue we're working very hard on. Looking at the questions, Craig Rimmer, who I know follows politics as closely as I do, if not more so, says, have we heard any more from Labour on whether they favour the lifetime provider model or not? Joe, perhaps do you have any insight there?
We haven't heard a great deal from Labour on how they think about the lifetime provider model. We have heard fairly recently from the TUC that they have got a great deal of concerns about the lifetime provider model and the impact on savers, in particular with that kind of question of, does it simply mean increased charge costs through marketing or other means onto savers, and therefore the kind of long-term detrimental impact on outcomes. So I imagine that will have an impact. I think the kind of broader backdrop theme to quite a lot of this, which has made it reasonably appealing, at least on a surface level, to politicians, is, does it provide a means to kind of simplify the system a little bit, so you kind of get everybody into a smaller number of providers and they're there with them for life, and therefore those providers get bigger, they invest more in the UK, they do more sophisticated investment strategies. Now, there's a lot of fallacies in all of that, aren't there? So I'm not going to kind of support them, but I think it's probably just saying that those are some of the inferences of why people find some of it attractive. But I think that's when you kind of get to the point of saying, actually, where's the evidence? What's the protocol? What's the aim? And the aim from any of these changes must be better outcomes for savers. And if we're not getting there, and if we're going to disconnect employers, we're going to put savers at odd asymmetric market where they're having to make choices, not being very informed. It feels to me that that's going to be a number of very big hurdles to get over.
Thanks, Joe. And Mark Dowsey is somewhat concerned that the tone of the initial consultation was how to move to a lifetime provider model rather than whether to. A well put question. Alyshia, any thoughts on that? Do you share Mark's concern?
I do share Mark's concern. I have to say, I think this was something that alarmed me in the first reading of it as well. I think it was a surprise to us all, really, actually. I think how positively framed the idea was in that call for evidence. I mean, it was just a call for evidence. So it is a first step, and it is a very early step along a journey. But I would echo the sort of concern that Mark has, that this is often presented as some sort of fait accompli, like we're sort of we're going to end up there, and that would be great for everyone. And I'm not really sure that case has ever been made robustly. I think the other thing I would point others to is that in conversations, ongoing conversations, as always, with government and ministers, they do seem to still be of the perspective that it is net positive for members. And so though the call for evidence has not led to any sort of immediate moves to make any changes, and actually there was quite a lot of calmer language used in recent times in sort of public conversations about this, I do think there is a little bit of a group of people that do think that this is a great idea, and so we do have to keep making the case that there are or that we do, or at least sharing concerns that we have with it. There are some strong proponents of the idea, and I am sort of, I guess, sympathetic to some of the theory that sits behind that. I just don't think the context is right, and so this is why that those pieces in of the puzzle that need to be in place are so critical before you could even consider doing something like this, in my view.
Right, and let's just squeeze in one last question, maybe a quick answer if we can. The question is, do we expect there to be a significant reduction in the charge cap for the retail market in order to align with the charges on offer in the workplace market? AMC's TRs are often hidden by providers from member view, as they're not shown on annual statements, etc. Alyshia?
Sure. So I think it's a great question. I think this is officially is unanswered, but I think it would be required, basically. So my view would be that you couldn't do something that would undermine the protection that we have in the rest of the AE market. So, and the charge cap is one of those pieces of the puzzle. Trying to keep it short there. That's a great question. I could speak for longer.
Okay, well, thank you, Alyshia. And one of the things I was going to say is if people have got more questions or points that they want to ping in to our Joe and Alyshia after this, then by all means do so. So if we've not given sufficient detail on that or anything else, then let us know, and we'll happily answer that. And you can email to me. I think my details will be circulated in the rubric around all this. So thanks, Alyshia, and thank you, Joe, for your excellent contributions, for guiding us through these issues. We will circulate the slides and the recording. Those will come round to you all in a day or two. There'll be, of course, a request for feedback on this webinar. So do please let us have that. We really do look at that. As I say, if you've got any more questions, then just let us know. And otherwise, thank you to all our attendees for dialing in. And thanks again, Joe and Alyshia. And enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.